the last watchman of Stormwake Point. I used to work for the Coast Guard, mostly handling repairs and logistics for old navigational buildings up and down the East Coast. But one of my strangest assignments came in the fall of 2016, when I was sent to Stormwake Point Lighthouse, just off the coast of Maine. It was a lonely outpost on a jagged stretch of coast, no nearby towns, no roads, just a narrow dirt path from the dock up to the tower. The place had already been automated for years, but due to increasing fog in that area and an uptick in maritime traffic, they wanted one final month of human observation before they shut it down for good. I volunteered. Honestly, I was burned out from city work and thought a month alone with books and the ocean would be good for me. I packed light, a duffel bag, a radio, and my notebook. They dropped me off by boat and said they'd be back in 30 days. At first, it was exactly what I needed. Quiet. Clean air. The building was in decent shape, small kitchen, cot, emergency generator, and the old beacon light above, still turning slow and steady every night. But the heaviness started around night 3. I woke up at 2 a.m. to a loud thud overhead. The lantern room, where the massive light rotated, was locked at all times, and I had the only key. I climbed the spiral stairs, flashlight in hand. I half expected to find a broken bulb or a gull stuck inside. But the room was empty. Then I noticed something weird. On the inside of the glass, facing the sea, were handprints. Not smudges, clear, greasy, palm and fingerprints, like someone had pressed both hands hard against the window. They were too big to be mine. I cleaned them off. Wrote it off as maybe something left over from an old visitor or contractor. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I found the trapdoor to the lantern room open, even though I'd bolted it before bed. Upstairs, more handprints. Different this time. One set, low to the floor, like someone crawling. I started locking the inner doors too, not just the lantern hatch. It didn't matter. A few nights later, I was woken by the sound of footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming down the stairs. I sat up in my cot, heart racing, holding my flashlight like a weapon. The steps reached my level, then stopped. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, waiting. Then, just when I thought I imagined it, the doorknob to my room turned. Gently. No force. Just a slow, testing twist. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of the door. After that, I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd stay up, pacing, drinking coffee, watching the windows. I kept the radio on static just for noise. On day 11, I found the journal. It was tucked behind a loose panel in the kitchen, probably left by the last man stationed there before automation. Most of it was mundane, weather notes, sea conditions, maintenance logs. But in the final pages, the tone shifted. He walks at night. I hear him on the stairs. Sometimes I see the light stop spinning for a second, like it's watching something. He wants someone to stay. That was the last entry. I wanted out. I radioed headquarters on day 12, said I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie, and asked to be picked up early. They said weather wouldn't allow it for another 3 days. So I waited. That last night was the worst. It started with the light shutting off. Not flickering, fully dead. I ran up the stairs and tried the backup switch. Nothing. No power failure, no storms. Just blackness. And in that pitch-dark lantern room, I saw something move. Just beyond the glass, outside the lighthouse, something was climbing the walls. Pale, thin arms gripping the stone, legs bending the wrong way, long fingers searching for a window. And then, it was gone. I slammed the trapdoor and barricaded myself in the lower room. And all night, I heard it, climbing up, then down, pacing, tapping on the glass. Once, I heard it breathing through the vents. By morning, the generator kicked back on by itself. The light returned. They came for me that afternoon. I didn't say much. Just that the isolation got to me. They nodded. Said it happens. Before I left, I asked the boatman if anyone had ever disappeared from Stormwake Point. He hesitated, then said, "Not officially. But we stopped putting people out there for a reason." I haven't worked a lighthouse since. The end story. Story 2: The Radio Man of Black Harbor Light. My grandfather was a lighthouse keeper back in the 1970s, stationed at a now decommissioned place called Black Harbor Light, located on a remote stretch of Nova Scotia's coast. He only talked about it once, and even then, he didn't finish the story. He passed away 2 years ago. While cleaning out his attic, I found an old wooden box with his name burned into the top. Inside were radio logs, nautical maps, and a single cassette tape. The label just said, July 5, 1974, transmission 4. I had an old tape player and decided to listen. It started with static, then my grandfather's voice, clear but tense. Log 4, 9:12 p.m. I've locked the tower. Still hearing it on channel 3. Voice keeps repeating the same line, no ships in the area. Doesn't sound human. There was a pause, and then, a sound I will never forget. A voice came through the tape. Not my grandfather's. Not even human, really. It was distorted, like it was underwater, repeating the same phrase over and over. You let me drown. You let me drown. You let me drown. The tape clicked off after that. No conclusion. Just silence. That night, I called my mom. Asked if she remembered anything about Black Harbor. She said yes, but made me swear not to go there. Of course, I did anyway. It took effort, but I found the place. The lighthouse was still standing, hidden behind thick pine and cold ocean air. The stairs were rusted, the paint peeling off the walls. But in the radio room, everything was intact. Old dials, frequency markers, the MIC still mounted like it hadn't been touched in decades. I brought a small handheld radio and set it to channel 3. Nothing. Just dead static. I was about to leave when I noticed something carved into the inside of the wall. 4 words. He comes through sound. That night, I camped just outside the building. Bad idea. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. Not waves. Not wind. A voice, faint, but growing clearer. Coming from inside the lighthouse. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped in. The radio room was lit up, even though there was no power. The panel glowed faint green, and that same phrase from the tape was coming through the speakers. You let me drown. Only now, it knew my name. Jason, you let me drown. I ran. No shame in admitting it. I left my gear behind and drove 3 hours back to Halifax without stopping. 2 days later, I got a voicemail on my phone. I saved it. It was just static. But right at the end, I heard it again, the same voice. Quiet. Garbled. You, let me drown. I've changed my number since. Burned the tape. But sometimes, when I pass by a radio or static comes on TV, I feel like it's still trying to come through. Like something inside that place doesn't just haunt the lighthouse. It broadcasts. End story. Story 3. Disturbing true lighthouse horror story. In 2003, I was part of a seasonal maintenance crew hired by the state to inspect and restore aging coastal structures, mostly abandoned cabins, old piers, and historical buildings. The kind of places no one visits anymore unless they're paid to. One of our final assignments that fall was an old lighthouse located off the coast of northern Washington, perched on a narrow, jagged island they called Wrecker's Reach. I'd never heard of it before. Most locals hadn't either. Apparently, it had been shut down since the late 70s after a fire damaged the main building, and no one had bothered to go back since. But some coastal preservation group wanted to restore it and turn it into a maritime museum, and our job was just to inspect the remaining structure and take photos. I went with 2 other guys, Brian, a structural engineer in his early 40s, and Matt, a fresh hire just out of college. We were supposed to spend 2 days and 1 night there. The place was only reachable by boat, and once we got there, the captain said he'd return in exactly 36 hours. When we stepped onto the island, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds. No wind. Just the sound of the ocean below us crashing against black rocks. The lighthouse stood tall and crooked, paint stripped by storms, its glass lantern chamber broken and charred. Attached to it was a living quarters, what used to be the keeper's house. The door was swollen from moisture and opened with a splintering groan. Inside, everything was still. Dust-covered furniture. Broken plates. A rusted kettle still sitting on the stovetop like someone left in a hurry. We set up our gear in the main room and started documenting the damage. Matt took the ground floor, Brian climbed the tower, and I started photographing the living space. A few hours in, I felt something strange, like the walls were pulsing, almost breathing. Every time I stepped into the hallway, the air changed. Heavy. Like I had entered a completely different atmosphere. I kept brushing it off as mold or bad insulation, but deep down, I knew something was off. That night, we ate canned food by lantern light. Brian joked about the place being haunted. Matt didn't laugh. He said he kept hearing footsteps upstairs when he was alone. And not like creaks or wood shifting. Real footsteps. Heavy ones. Brian brushed it off. Probably seagulls on the roof. Matt didn't argue. But he didn't sleep either. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. There was no plumbing, so I walked outside to use the bushes near the side of the house. I remember looking up at the tower and noticing something strange. The lantern chamber was glowing. Not brightly, just a dull, faint amber light, like an old bulb struggling to stay alive. I assumed Brian or Matt had gone up there and turned something on. Maybe the old generator was still partially functional. When I came back inside, I saw both of them asleep. I didn't say anything. I just lay back down, staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours. That's when I heard it. A loud clang, like metal on metal, coming from the tower. Then, footsteps. I got up and walked quietly toward the base of the tower. The hatch to the stairs was closed. But I could hear the sound clearly, boots slowly making their way down the spiral steps. I knocked on Brian's door. He opened immediately, fully awake. "You heard that too," he whispered. We stood there for a few seconds, frozen. The steps stopped. Then, a dragging sound. Something being pulled. Brian grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the hatch. He shined the light upward. Nothing but rusted metal and crumbling stairs. We climbed to the first landing together. Still nothing. Then we heard it again. Thump, thump, thump. Coming from the top of the tower. The lantern room. Brian turned to me and said, "Let's just get this over with." As we reached the final set of steps, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath. There was no glass left in the chamber, just broken frames. Wind should have been pouring in, but it was completely still. When we stepped inside, the room was empty. Except for the smell. Burnt hair. Charcoal. And something metallic, like blood. We checked every corner. Nothing. But just before we turned to leave, Brian pointed at the floor. There were boot prints in the dust. Fresh. Leading from the broken window to the center of the room, and then just stopping. No return trail. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, Matt was gone. His sleeping bag was there. His backpack was there. But he wasn't. We searched the island for hours. Called out. Circled the lighthouse over and over. Nothing. We even climbed back to the lantern room, just in case. That's when Brian found something tucked in the corner under a loose floorboard. Matt's notebook. The last page had only 2 words. He watches. We waited until the boat came back. Told the captain everything. He radioed the Coast Guard, and they searched for 3 days. They never found Matt's body. The restoration was cancelled. The project was buried. But sometimes, I dream about that lighthouse. And in the dream, I'm back in that lantern room, standing in the center, and I can't move. Because behind me, I can hear boots on the metal stairs. Getting closer. Every time. End story. Story 4. The Night Watchman, Disturbing Lighthouse. In 2011, I took a short-term job through a security agency. They needed someone to watch over an isolated, decommissioned lighthouse that had recently been bought by a private collector. The owner didn't live there. In fact, he never visited. He just wanted someone present at night for insurance purposes, and was willing to pay generously. The lighthouse was located on a small patch of rocky land just beyond a stretch of foggy coastline in Maine. You couldn't drive to it. I had to take a small ferry, then hike a mile across jagged terrain to reach it. The locals called the place Drowning Point. I should have taken that name more seriously. The job seemed simple: stay overnight in the attached keeper's house, check all entries twice, report anything unusual. There was no electricity in the lighthouse itself, just in the small living quarters next to it, powered by a noisy old generator. My first few nights were uneventful. Boring, really. I'd bring a book, eat dinner, do my checks, and sleep. The lighthouse, despite being abandoned for decades, felt solid. Old, but not creepy. That changed on night 4. It started with the radio. I was eating noodles, and the small emergency radio crackled to life on its own. I hadn't even turned it on. Through the static, I heard a man's voice. "He's still in the walls." Then silence. I checked the unit. It wasn't tuned to any frequency. Just off. I blamed it on interference, maybe a nearby ship's transmission bleeding through. But later that night, around 1:30 a.m., I heard banging coming from the lighthouse tower. 3 bangs. Then silence. I went outside with my flashlight. The wind had picked up, and the fog had thickened. The tower stood there like a shadow against the sky, tall, cold, silent. I approached the base and unlocked the metal door. It creaked open. The smell hit me first, wet wood and rotting salt. I shined my light up the spiral stairs. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, something fell from above. Clang! A wrench. An old rusted tool. It landed just a few feet from me. I aimed the flashlight up again. Nothing. Just emptiness. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I called the agency and reported the strange events. They laughed. Said it was probably an animal. Maybe raccoons nesting in the tower. So I went back for night 5. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked behind a loose brick in the wall beside the fireplace. A leather-bound logbook, old and mouldy. The name on the first page was Captain Elias Greaves. The entries started in 1932. They began normal enough. Notes about weather. Ship sightings. Routine stuff. But about halfway through, things turned dark. I hear them in the fog now. Every night. Whispering. Calling my name. The light turns itself on, even when the oil runs dry. They said the sea took her. But she's in the mirror. Watching. The final entry was just 4 words. The tide is inside. I shut the journal, chilled. That night, I kept all the lights on in the keeper's quarters. I didn't plan on checking the tower again. But at exactly 2:07 a.m., the light came on. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse began to glow. Bright, white, piercing through the fog. There was no power in the tower. No bulb. The lantern had been removed decades ago. Yet there it was, turning slowly, illuminating the coast. I stared out the window, frozen. Then my radio crackled again. He's walking now. I turned toward the door, footsteps. Heavy. Wet. Coming from the basement. There shouldn't have been a basement. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door under the stairs. A steep, stone staircase descended into darkness. I swear it hadn't been there before. Against my better judgment, I stepped down. The walls were dripping. The air, thick with salt and rot. As I reached the bottom, I saw it. A room, stone walls, covered in barnacles. In the center, a mirror. An old, freestanding mirror with a cracked frame and black glass. I approached, heart hammering. My reflection wasn't there. Instead, I saw the ocean. Endless, black, waves crashing silently. And then, her. A woman, pale and soaked, standing waist-deep in the water. Her eyes were hollow. Her mouth opened slowly. And from the radio upstairs, I heard it clearly. He let me drown. I stumbled back and sprinted up the stairs. The footsteps followed, wet slaps against stone, growing louder, faster. I locked the basement door and sat against it, shaking. At sunrise, I packed everything and left. I didn't take the journal. I didn't report anything. I just left. The agency never asked why. They never reassigned the post. To this day, the light still turns on sometimes. Fishermen say they see it on foggy nights. They say the sea took her. But I know better. She's still in that mirror. Waiting for someone else to look. The end.